Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first of a three-part series, an online mini course instructed by Dr. Donovan Ramon, the Bildner Visiting Scholar for Fall 2023. And I am Nancy Sinkoff, the Academic Director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life and Professor of Jewish Studies and History here at Rutgers. And it is my great privilege to have worked so far this term with Dr. Ramon, and now with you, experience learning from him directly about his field of scholarly expertise, which are narratives of racial and ethnic passing. Some of you know the drill about online learning, but let me just remind you, this is a webinar format. All of you are muted, but we have organized in such a way that you will have an opportunity to interact, at least your questions, with Dr. Ramon by writing them in the chat. And he will break at around 20-25 minutes after he begins to take initial questions, because there's a lot of material, as there always is. And then we will take questions at the end. So please use the chat feature to write your questions. I will moderate them. The other issue I want to tell you about the online format is that closed captions are available. So you can see on the bottom of your screen, there is a closed caption icon, and you can press it, and that will allow you to have a transcript underneath. And just know that the transcription is not perfect. The robots still haven't won the war against us. They will, but not yet. The mini course is being recorded and will be on the Bildner Center website later in the week, as will the other two sessions. So let me introduce our instructor, Professor Donovan Ramon. Donovan Ramon is an assistant professor of English at Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville and the Fall 2023 Bildner Center Scholar here at Rutgers. He is a native New Yorker, and he earned his BA in English in the Special Honors Program at Hunter College, CUNY, and then earned his PhD here at New Brunswick in the English department, right in Murray Hall on Voorhees Mall, for those of you who know the campus. He is a specialist in African American and African diasporic literatures, and he has published scholarly articles on Philip Roth and Alice Dunbar Nelson, and guest edited a double issue of the South Atlantic Review commemorating the 90th anniversary of Nella Larson's breakout novel, The Harlem Renaissance, Passing. His first book, which it's incredibly exciting for anyone to have their first book almost in their hands, is entitled Psychoanalysis, Striking Features, Psychoanalysis, and Racial Passing Narratives, and it will be published in February 2024 by Mercer University Press. So please welcome me, cyberly, Professor Donovan Ramon, who will lead us in today's class on racial passing, efforts to belong and assimilate in the United States. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Sinkoff and the Bildner Center, for this invitation for me to present some ideas, some research topics, some things I've been thinking about for a while now, and I get to present it to you all, my willing and ready audience. I'm thankful. I'm in a central time zone, so I know many of you are in the Eastern time zone. It's an hour later there than it is here. I'm super thankful that, for some of you, this is your dinner time and you're spending it here with me. So thank you very much. I am going to begin my presentation. Let me share my screen. Okay. So the topics we're going to discuss tonight, Black and Jewish intersections and passings. We're going to talk about some of the terminology that we can use to talk about the ways which African Americans and Jewish Americans have integrated in the United States, so assimilated, what have you, here in the United States. I'm going to start, honestly, with a poem that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, The New Colossus by Emma Lazarus. And this is the poem that is at the base of the Statue of Liberty. I'm happy to report that picture of the Statue of Liberty is one that I took myself in 2017 when I escorted students there on a trip a few years ago. So I'm going to read this poem. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman a mighty woman with a torch whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air bridge harbor that twin cities frame. Of course, this second stanza is the one that is most familiar to everyone. Keep ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest toast to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. I begin with Lazarus and the New Colossus because this is a poem about America, about liberty, about freedom. Of course, the fact that it's at the base of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor, of course, on Ellis Island, to me is very significant because what it's saying is that we're going to welcome, we as in the United States, we will welcome everyone to this country. We all know this is not true. There's some folks who have been welcomed while others have not been welcomed, right? So let's keep this in mind. This is very much a quintessentially American poem by Emma Lazarus, who was a Jewish American writer of the late 19th century. I think it's very important to keep this in mind, not only the ethos of freedom and liberty and welcoming and warmth, but also the fact that what has welcomed generations of folks to Ellis Island has been these lines by a Jewish American writer, Emma Lazarus. It is this notion of America that I want to keep in mind here. Efforts to belong and assimilate in the United States. These efforts have been going on for as long as the United States has been in existence, right? In a century before the Statue of Liberty opened in 1886, so in a century before that, Americans faced questions on who really could belong here in the United States. The founding fathers initiated these questions when they drafted the U.S. Constitution, which was ratified in 1789. And of course, in their conversations, they decided that straight land-owning white men were the ones who maintained the most power, okay? This country was founded by straight land-owning white men. Many of them were slave owners. And as a result, a lot of that straight landowning white male mentality is what has persisted throughout the United States, throughout American history. Because of that, those who did not fall under these categories often had the most scrutiny and faced the most hardship. And of course, as often as African Americans and Jewish Americans who had to develop many ways in which to assimilate or at least to fit in with American society. Of course, in the 19th century, questions of enslavement and freedom faced many Americans. And as a result of those issues, many folks had to face the ideas of assimilation and what it means to fit in the United States. This presentation will uncover some of the ways in which members of these groups had to alter their identities in which to fit in. Now, I say some of the ways because I may not know all the ways. You might know some that I don't know about. And I want this to be, when it comes to the Q&A part, a full-fledged dialogue. You can let me know, what are some things that you know? What are some ways in which folks have assimilated in this country that I have not uncovered? Because I would love to know about them and we can have a full-fledged dialogue afterwards. One way in which we see Jews assimilating in the United States is through name changing. This entailed, of course, name changing entailed creating new Americanized surnames. I put Americanized in quotes because that could be subjective. What is considered Americanized names, right? This entailed created new Americanized surnames. There is no one way in which this was done, meaning that not every Jewish person who came here changed their names. Some did on their own. Some did with their families. Some did because they were forced to, which I'll get to in another slide. But what I want to emphasize here is that name changing was one way in which Jews assimilated to the United States. It was not the only way, and there was no monolithic way, meaning it was not something that everybody did or did one way. Some roots of Jewish names remained, and I have some here. Rose, Burke, and Libau, they have remained some of the roots of Jewish last names. On your right, you'll see the cover of a book, A Rosenberg by Another Name, and you'll see here, Rosenberg in some cases became Rose, Greenberg became Green, Epstein became Edwards, and Rabinowitz became Robbins. Again, one way in which Jews assimilated in the United States was through assimilation. What I want to make clear here is that it was not as simple as shedding old identities in favor of completely new ones. Many folks maintained hybrid identities. They were hybrid identities. It wasn't a matter of you came to America, you got a new name, and you forgot the ways from the past. It was a matter of you got a new name, yes, but it wasn't simply a matter of shedding your old identity. But often, not always, in many cases, the identities became hybrid. When it comes to name changing, it became most prominent between 1917 and 1967, when thousands of New York Jews changed their names for many reasons, to fight anti-Semitism, to find jobs, and to receive an education. So prominent examples of people, we know about or we've heard about. Carol Klein became Carol King, of course, the world-renowned musician. Ralph Lifshitz became Ralph Lauren, of course, the world-renowned fashion designer. And name changing sometimes occurred without their knowledge. And I have an anecdote here. A Jewish immigrant arriving at Ellis Island forgot his name and said Shane Ferguson. And I forgive me if I'm not saying it properly, but it is Yiddish for I've already forgotten. The intake officer asked his name, and this is what he said: Shane Ferguson. I've already forgotten. This was recorded on Ellis Island as Sean Ferguson. We may not know what this person's name was, this person's birth name was, but because of the translation that happened in Yiddish at Ellis Island, it was translated to Sean Ferguson. And my ideas or what I've gathered here about name changing, I have to cite Kirsten Firmeglich, who wrote A Rosenberg by Any Other Name. It is an excellent book. It is an excellent book about name changing, about Jewish name changing. Another example is conversion, conversion, which is defined as adopting a set of beliefs identified with a specific religious denomination. There is not an official church in the United States, but an implicit Christian church and society. As such, Jews do not have to formally convert here in the United States. They could exit I'm sorry, let me move this over. They could exit the Jewish community with they could, I'm not saying they would. They could, the possibility is there to exit the Jewish community with little trouble. Conversion happens more often in Europe with legal and religious implications, since Jewish identity was most racialized throughout the 20th century. So now we have two ways in which we see Jewish identity being changed here: through name changing, one, and through conversion. I'm sorry, I see a hand raised here. Should I take questions now? I can. Should I, Professor Sinkoff or Sarah?
I'm trying to see, I don't see the hands.
Okay.
It's
I
not.
do. I see Dana is raising their hand.
Okay, so if this person could write it in the chat, I can't, I'm not seeing the raised hands. I don't know why.
Uh-oh. I just see one. Yeah, I see Dana.
So please put that in the chat, and I will, if I need to interrupt Dr. Ramon, I will. If not, we'll wait till 7:25:26.
Okay. So I'm going to turn now to Heinrich Heine. I hope I pronounced that right. Heinrich Heine, a German Jewish writer who was baptized as Lutheran in 1825. He saw baptism as his, quote, ticket to admission to European culture. And those are his words. His baptism was his ticket to admission to European culture. If you, of course, the materials for this webinar were posted online a few days ago, and there's a link to his letter and his life story on the Building Center's website. What's fascinating about him, his baptism did not help him secure coveted jobs in Germany, did not help him secure it. Thus, he left for Paris in 1831 and remained there in exile until his death, for a few years until his death. I bring him up as an example of what conversion, as an example of conversion, right? Because if you understand conversion, it's adopting a set of beliefs identified with a specific religious denomination. And it occurred most often in a European context. I'm not saying that it didn't happen here, it occurred most often in a European context, with Heine being one example. His story demonstrates conversion from one religion to another. He was deeply ambivalent about his Jewish identity and wrote a letter expressing his shame and regret. And here I'm going to read some brief excerpts from his writing. Now, I'm hated by both Christians and Jews. I'm very sorry that I converted to Christianity, and I have not felt better since. And yet, I hold it beneath my dignity and a stain on my honor to undergo conversion in order to obtain a position in Prussia. Dear old Prussia, I really do not know what course to take in this bad situation. I think, we should meditate on these lines because he's clearly ambivalent about his conversion. He's clearly ambivalent about what he had to do. There's a lot of, I would say there's a lot of shame. There's a lot of loss. There's a lot of guilt in terms of what he had to endure by converting to a new religion while he in the 19th century. And I also want to meditate this. I want us to meditate on the second paragraph, second quote specifically, where he says, "And yet I hold it beneath my dignity and a stain on my honor to undergo conversion, a stain on my honor." And our next session, next week, we're going to read excerpts of The Human Stain by Philip Roth. And it's a story about a light-skinned African-American professor who passed as Jewish in the late 20th century. So the title of that book is The Human Stain. Heine here is saying, yet I hold it beneath my dignity and a stain. There's something there about that phrase, the word stain, and how some folks saw their conversion, or how some people viewed their newer identities as a stain, as a mark, as something that I suppose is pejorative. Another term here to throw in, more terminology for what some folks have done: assimilation. Both name changing and conversion can assist with assimilation. This is defined, the definition here is in bold. This is defined as the process through which individuals and groups of differing heritages acquire the basic habits, attitudes, and modes of life of a dominant culture. Some examples: conforming to American political or social views, or celebrating American holidays, or minimizing one's cultural background and conversation. Another example, eating American cuisine. So I'm going to give a personal example here. My mother's side of the family, they are from Honduras in Central America. In Honduras, they do not celebrate Thanksgiving. When they came to this country and they discovered Thanksgiving as a holiday to celebrate, there's now a divide between some of the older Hondurans and some of the younger ones. Some have assimilated, they will say, by having turkey, by celebrating Thanksgiving, one, but also by having turkey as a centerpiece of their meals. Others, like my mother and my late grandmother, we celebrated Thanksgiving growing up, but instead of having turkey, which is a traditional Thanksgiving meal from America, they replaced that main meat with pernil. Pernil is roast pork, which is dominant in Central America and in Honduras and throughout Central America. To me, that is one example from my own family of assimilating, celebrating the holiday, Thanksgiving, which is, of course, an American holiday, but replacing the main dish with pernil, which is roast pork. Okay. So I actually think I'm going to pause here because I do see some hands coming up. I'm going to pause here and I'm going to get into sort of other aspects of identity creation. Professor Sinkoff, I'll turn it over to you now, Professor Sinkoff.
So our participants, can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me and see me?
Mm-hmm.
If you have a question for Dr. Ramon, please put it in the chat. There are too many of you for us to call on you. So even though there's some raised hands, we can't do it. There are almost 70 people in the webinar.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you can take the time to write in the chat, I will definitely communicate your question to Professor Ramon, but we're not in a webinar format. We can't call on you. So I see at least 3 raised hands, but I still am not seeing anything in the chat. So, yeah. So
Okay.
I would just like to second, really underscore
Mhm.
for the audience what you noticed, Professor Roman, which is that Europe and America are really different. And that sounds rather obvious, but because immigrants, no matter where they come from, feel such strong attachments to where they come from, there can kind of be a blurring. It was like that in the old country, it's like that in the new country. But it is very true that for Jews, the European experience is one thing and the American experience is very different. It's not to say there aren't any continuities, feeling different, pressures to assimilate, all those things are true. But the difference between having, as you said, an established church, that the
Mhm.
only way to function in civil society was to convert, that is radically different in the United States. And of course, for people of color and for African Americans, the institutionalization of slavery, etc., and the way in which the color line is so legalized in this country is going to make that very different from the experience of people of color in other parts of the world.
Right.
So I think what's really in some ways very challenging intellectually, because we historians don't like to talk about American exceptionalism. We don't want to say that America is different from every other place in the world
Mhm.
and that is better. That's what that means. But in fact, with some of these categories, we can see very distinctive American features. And I think that
Right.
your work has shown that. So
Mhm.
let's see. Someone in the chat is asking, someone wrote something. Uh,
Okay.
oh, okay. The chat was disabled. I don't control the technology. The chat is abled. So
Okay.
please, if you have a question, there we go. Let's see. Oh, I see. I see. Okay. So if anyone has a hand raised and wants to put the chat in, please do. You kind of have half a minute because we don't want to run out of time for the material. But if you have any questions about some of the terminology, and again, Professor Ramon started with Emma Lazarus. I think that's very extremely relevant because Lazarus is an American Jew, a
Mhm.
Jew of an American Jewish origin. Her words are at Ellis Island, which is seen as the gateway of immigration and the gateway of possibility. But the point is that for many people of color, they didn't even go through Ellis Island.
Mhm.
So this idea of liberty and the gateway really obtains mostly Europeans. Okay, people want recommended books, people want all kinds of things, but you know what? I'm going to look at the chat while you continue and
Okay.
summarize some of the questions for the second part because I
Mhm.
think I'm just seeing the time. Okay, so
Okay.
everyone, please put your comments in the chat. I'm taking notes and I will bring it back. Okay. Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That was actually a very good segue because I'm going to shift a little bit to shared experiences in the United States, shared experiences between African Americans and Jews in the United States. But I want to begin, Lazarus, of course, is where I began. I want to reiterate how certain things are distinctly American. My last anecdote was about Thanksgiving. And, I know it was just a week ago. I don't mean to make you all hungry by my discussion of turkey and perennial. I just bring it up as an example of what is distinctly American and how some folks have navigated that via assimilation. The United States is steeped in dualities. And I think I think we all know that it's steeped in dualities. And some examples of that: black or white, gay or straight, man or woman, Democrat or Republican. The United States is very much steeped in dualities. As a result, many African Americans and Jews have tried to fit within these very rigid boundaries. One example, so I'm going to shift now to W.E.B. Du Bois, who was an African-American intellectual at the beginning, well, his lifespan, the first 6 decades of the 20th century. A lot of his output happened in between 1900 and 1960, per se, 1950, 1960. Anyway, the first half of the 20th century, many of his ideas about race and the color line permeated. And this is a very important quote from his very important book, The Souls of Black Folk, from 1903. The problem of the 20th century, is a problem of the color line. W.E.B. Du Bois and the Souls of Black Folk. What he's saying here is, so right under that I write, the color line refers to the racial boundary between blacks and whites in the United States. I want to qualify that even more. The color line refers to the rigid racial boundary between blacks and whites in the United States. Very rigid. As a result of that rigid color line, those who could navigate that color line or those who could jump that color line have done so for generations. He was a premier Black scholar of the 20th century who argued that African Americans maintain a double consciousness by being Black in a majority white society. A double consciousness, being Black in a majority white society, a duality, if you will, yet another duality that is distinctly American, right? Part of that double consciousness, or I should say, that double consciousness is played out in a few different ways. And one way in which it's played out is through passing. Passing refers to creating a new identity that is different from the one you were born with. Now, I suspect that many of the participants on this call, you've heard of the term passing before. Most often it is used with racial passing. I qualify that here. Most often it is used with racial passing, meaning African Americans who pretended to be white to escape racism. Well, for many reasons, but one dominant reason was to escape racism. And I think it is comparable to Jews changing their names and converting to Christianity, since these endeavors helped minimize anti-Semitism and allowed for a better blending within American society. What African Americans and Jews have tried to do is try their best to, maybe blending in is not the right word. I'm not even sure assimilating is the right word, but they're trying their best to fit it within American society. Given American racial norms and American ethnic norms, these two different groups have tried their best to fit within. And one example is through passing, okay? Again, that refers to creating a new identity that is different from the one you were born with. I kept that definition slightly broad only because even though it's most often linked with racial passing, I think we could see today many different examples of passing. For example, passing, if it's about identity creation or identity formation, folks can pass any number of ways, including through class or race, sexuality, religion, or ethnicity. You might be familiar with some real life examples of passing over the past few years. Rachel Dolezal and Jessica Krug, two academics who passed as Black. They weren't passing as white. Jessica Krug is Jewish American who passes as Black, and Rachel Dolezal, I don't quite know what her identity is because she claims she was born as white and she passes Black, but I don't know, other than her parents saying that she's white, I don't know any more specifics about her. She's made a bunch of claims, but it's hard to follow what she said because she's changed her identities so often. But at any rate, passing occurs a number of ways. Rachel Dolezal is one example, Jessica Krug is another example. There are some fictional examples that you may have heard of. The Ex-Colored Man and James Weldon Johnson's The Ex-Colored Man, Coleman Silk in The Human Stain by Philip Roth, and Claire Kendry and Nella Larson's Passing. Coleman Silk is somebody we're going to meditate on next week when we read excerpts of The Human Stain. For those of you who will participate next week, I believe The Human Stain is also on Audible, so you should be able to listen to it, or you see an excerpt on the Business Center's website, or if you want a copy, certainly many copies are available through Amazon and or your local library. Claire Kendry is another example in Nella Larson's Passing. Passing is the premier novella on racial passing. It came out in 1929, and maybe some of you may have saw the movie that came out a few years ago on Netflix, Passing, the Netflix adaptation of Passing. At any rate, what I'm getting at is that passing has been going on for a long, long time, and it's not strictly an African-American phenomenon. I think passing, because it refers to creating new identities, anyone can really pass. And as I note here, there are different ways in which people could pass. These are just some of many examples. Another example, if you looked at our website, you saw Langston Hughes, a short story called Who's Passing for Who, from 1953. Now, first of all, Langston Hughes was one of the premier writers of, not just Black writers, but premier writers of the 20th century. He wrote poetry, he wrote plays, he wrote short stories, a premier writer. Even though he's most affiliated with the Harlem Renaissance, like Du Bois, his life spanned many decades and his output went over many decades. He wrote both a short story and a poem about passing. I believe passing was very important to him because it came up so often in his writing. What I have here is an image of Mr. Hughes and an excerpt from Who's Passing for Who. She leaned out the window and said with a grin, "Listen, boys, I hate to confuse you again, but to tell the truth, my husband and I aren't really colored at all. We're white. We just thought we'd kid you by passing for colored a little while. Just as you said, Negroes pass sometimes for white." She laughed and they sped off towards Central Park, waving goodbye. We didn't say a thing. We just stood there on a corner in Harlem, dumbfounded, not knowing now which way we'd been fooled. Were they really white? Were they really white passing for colored, or colored passing for white? Whatever race they were, they had had too much fun at our expense, even if they did pay for the drinks. So what the narrator is saying here, of course, this is about Caleb's friends here. Caleb is the protagonist, and he is entertaining friends who are light-skinned, white. They're either light-skinned African Americans passing as white, or white people passing as black. This is the end of the short story, Who's Passing for Who, by Langston Hughes. This is the end. But the story keeps asking us this question of who is passing for who. That's why it's a title. Who's passing for who? Because identity is so fluid when it comes to the United States. Even though you have these very rigid racial lines, the fact that people can surpass these lines, can overcome these lines, can navigate the color line, to use Du Bois's terms. That lets us know that the color line is not as rigid as we might initially assume, right? The fact that you can navigate it and cross it. What's being asked here is who's passing? Are the white folks passing for black, or are the black folks passing for white? This is a question that I think undergirds a lot of issues when it comes to identity. Who are you pretending to be as? Of course, it's a lot more complex than this, but it is something for us to meditate on. So I want to sort of highlight, again, some of the key terms here. Name changing, which of course refers to changing of one's name. Conversion, adopting a set of beliefs identified with a specific religious denomination. Passing, creating a new identity that is different from one that you were born with. And assimilations, which of course, the process through which individuals and groups of differing heritages acquire the basic habits, attitudes, and mode of life of an embracing culture. These are just some of the different ways in which we see African Americans and Jewish Americans creating new identities for themselves here in the United States, a country that was founded on freedom and liberty and, the ideals of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. But I would argue that the fact that you have so many people trying to fit in within these Americanized norms really complicates what these Americanized norms really mean in the first place. So at this point, I'm going to stop. I do want to hear what your questions are. I want to thank you, first of all, for listening. I know it's a lot of material and a lot of terminology. There's probably some terminology I don't even know about, and I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the terminology, on your experiences. Maybe there's some things that we could talk about, that we can quibble with. I'm curious as to what comes to mind in light of all these terms when it comes to race and identity in America. Thank you.
So there are quite a few comments in the chat, and then some various suggestions. So before, and some, I'm going to try and start from the beginning and then come towards the end. So first, the experience of Jewish name changing and conversion, just like that of light-skinned Blacks trying to pass, are products of structures of, in the Jewish case, anti-Semitism, or in the case of light-skinned Blacks, anti-Black racism. So can you say something else about that in terms of the motivation, if you will? What prompts people? What have you seen in the literary work that you've studied to do that? How do they explain, if you will, their motivations?
They explain it either via they explain it via what they have observed in terms of discrimination, anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, Oftentimes for African Americans, they see some sense, not some sense, they see racialized violence, such as a lynching. In a sense of some African American women, they saw lynching, they saw rape, or they were afraid of either of those two happening. And as a result of those racialized violence, they decided it's better that they create new identities for themselves than run the risk of facing any more of those types of violence.
So
Um,
passing in some ways is I think what you're saying is that passing is a strategy that illustrates the unfulfilled promise of the Statue of Liberty as a metaphor.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And in getting to some of the nitty-gritty of my research, I would say there's some psychoanalysis going on. There's something psychological going on. It's not just the external motivation of needing to avoid violence, of needing to avoid anti-Semitism, but they also understand that passing and creating new identities, the internal motivation is also they see that they get better, their lives become easier by having new identities. Even in some of the examples I cited, is you get better education, better housing, better jobs. There's so many things that it's part of it is hard to sort of encapsulate, but we could speculate that it's external motivations, certainly internal ones that motivate folks to create new identities for themselves.
And speaking about the internal, and you mentioned it when you looked at Heine, I think maybe we'll see it more in Nella Larson's work, but I'm wondering even in the Langston Hughes story, and you only shared the end with people, you might want to give them maybe a little background earlier, but I'm curious about the ambivalence, because Heine expressed ambivalence. He was in limbo. So one of our questioners said, are those who convert or assimilate or pass are they living lives in limbo? How do you see that in the literary works you've studied?
Yes, they're certainly living lives in limbo because they have passed. They have I'll use a case of African Americans who are light-skinned, they're light-skinned African Americans who pretend to be white. They face this dilemma of they understand their family history, but they are afraid to go back to their families. Oftentimes, passing means for African Americans turning your back on your Blackness, on Black history, and they're living completely as white. And in literature, I notice not only is it a matter of living as white, but it's a matter of movement too. They were moved from predominantly Black areas like Harlem to predominantly white areas, but they also want to go back. They say they don't want to go back, but there's also some motivation when they hear some bad news back from their family, or they see African Americans on the street. There's some pull that they want to go back. They are in a state of limbo. They often feel this back and forth between Blackness and whiteness, between what they turn their back on and what they have assumed, the new identities that they've assumed.
Okay, there are a lot of there's a lot going on in the chat. Okay. Book recommendations. So I just want to say to our public, first of all, Professor Ramon and I are organizing a symposium in the spring, which is an academic symposium. There will be a public program. You'll hear all about it through the Bildner Center eBlast. This mini course is a little bit of the beginning or the entry to this larger topic. And on our website, we are in the process of forming a tab that will have book recommendations. This topic of passing and assimilation and limbo status or liminal status for minorities is a very, very big topic in literature, in sociology and history, and we will do our best. So thank you, all of you who put recommendations in the chat. Some of them we already know about, but we will share it widely with you. But getting back to some comments that I think are really interesting for everyone to hear. There is you noticed or you've said, movement from either an inner city environment or to another environment, the possibility of passing or the limits. There's also regional distinctions for Jews in America. The difference between living in a densely urban space where there are many, many Jews versus the pressures, for example, Jews in the South, Jews in smaller frontier towns where there isn't a Jewish community to which to belong in the same force, same robustness, and therefore the pressures to assimilate can be so much greater. And you do have examples of religious conversion in the United States. But again, I want to say to the person who noticed that, which was really helpful, that it's a very much a voluntary conversion with implicit status rewards, but very different than in Europe, where at least theoretically, until the period of the German Nazi period, there were really tangible rewards. There were tangible rewards for conversion. I mean, Heine's case is very complicated because of Prussia, and that's a whole story until modern Germany is created in 1871. But there were tangible rewards for conversion in European society, and it's different in the United States. The rewards are more limited or more implicit. So another question someone asked is, have you in your work thought about what we call exogamy or intermarriage as either a form of passing or a form of assimilation between people of color, blacks and whites, or blacks and others? And certainly in the Jewish case, intermarriage to non-Jews affords a vehicle for, quote, passing. Have you come across that in your work?
Yes, intermarriage, certainly as a result of the Loving versus State of Virginia case in 1967.
Can you say more about that case? So good. Yeah, thank you.
That case was the Supreme Court case in which intermarriage became, the Supreme Court case in 1967, which in Loving, and I forgot the litigant's first name, versus State of Virginia. And in that case, my apologies, I just was distracted by too many comments popping up.
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm sorry, because I thought I didn't see the comments and now I see them coming up.
Okay, go ahead. Just ignore them. I'll deal with them.
Sorry, no. Sorry. I lost my train of thought. Yes, I look at intermarriage, but specifically the products of intermarriage. Oftentimes those who so let's just say a black and white family, right? With that intermarriage, the children of that intermarriage, if they're light-skinned enough, they face the question of whether they're going to pass into American society, into white dominant society or not. I have seen it not only in literature, but also in real life. The children of those who intermarry, this is a question that they face. I'm not saying that they do or they don't. I won't make a blanket statement, but I will say that they face that question. Will they pass into whiteness, or will they maintain their blackness, or will they maintain dual identity? And if that's the case, then they are concrete examples of W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. When he talks about his double consciousness, they make that clear, whether they're able to pass as white or they decide to maintain their black identity.
So there's a question actually about double consciousness. So a member of the audience says, can we interrogate the concept of double consciousness? Wasn't passing exogenous only? A black individual passing as white was expressly black when returning home. So the question isn't entirely clear to me, but can we interrogate the concept of double consciousness? Perhaps you can just actually say something about Du Bois's concept, and then and then the issue of, I think what the questioner is saying is that someone it's one way. By the way, everyone out there, my colleague, now retired emeritus, Evyatar Zerubbabel, a brilliant sociologist, used to talk about this, the unidirectionality of certain things. Like, why isn't it that they don't go both ways? So when a light-skinned black person passes for white, when he or she goes home, they may return to being black, but it's a unidirectional passing. So anyway, perhaps Professor Ramon, you can say more about this doubleness and the directionality.
I think we can always interrogate double consciousness. Any academic concept we can interrogate. Yes, we can. But in that interrogation, let's not forget too that American society is very much based in dualities, and Du Bois is tapping into that. When he theorizes double consciousness, he's explicitly saying African Americans in this country face a duality between, are they going to maintain their blackness, between maintaining their blackness and fitting in within white society. So yes, we could interrogate it, but let's not forget that because we're in America that's steeped in dualities, and he's seeing the dualities that African Americans have to contend with. We can interrogate it, but we also know that I think he's spot on with a lot of what he's saying and his theorization in The Souls of Black Folk. I think he's spot on. Now, the other part of the question, when it's one directional, passing, the definition I put here is broad enough to encompass passing in many ways. So it is one, it doesn't always have to be one directional. I gave the examples of Rachel Dolezal and Jessica Krug, who pass as Black. So I think if you take the capacious definition of passing that I work with and that I put here, the creation of a new identity that's not the one you're born with, I think it can happen in any number of ways. To and from, it can happen in any number of ways.
So someone asked a question about, if you have interracial marriages, sometimes the children are darker, quote unquote, than their parents. And sorry, this is anecdotal, but I'm thinking about the whole, shall we say, royal family insanity, because whatever, but the whole question of whether or not Princess or Queen to be Markel, I'm forgetting, whether or not the children would reflect her heritage as a Black person or not, and the racism that they say they got from the royal house. I mean, let's leave People magazine out of it. I have no idea. But this whole question of children of interracial marriages who are skin tone darker may not have the option.
Right. That's right. They may not have the option. And not only do they not always have the option, but parents in those relationships have to worry whenever there's the chance of kids coming out. They have to worry, will the kids be darker? Will they be light-skinned? If they're fully passing as white and they give birth to darker skinned kids, then their passing really ends because the kids reveal their racial background. So it's absolutely fraught. There's no, it's fraught and it's difficult. And if folks who are in an interracial relationship, when they decide to give birth, they have to consider that. The complexion of the kids. Will the complexion reveal their blackness or continue revealing their whiteness? So and to be clear, not everybody decides to pass. Some folks don't, but if they have the option to, they sometimes choose to.
Right. Again, the case for Jews and Judaism is it's both different and similar. Like different and similar. We've seen the similarities are a minority status in a dominant society, the desire to integrate, assimilate, and be accepted, the real discriminations that occur socially and otherwise, violence and otherwise, mobility and otherwise. But and then the cost of assimilating or passing, which is liminal status, limbo, discomfort with self, betrayal of family. So in that regard, you have a lot of similarities. The differences, of course, is that at least in the post-war period, even though many Jews feel uncomfortable with this designation, Jews are perceived of having been allowed to pass as white, right? Many Jews resent this because they do not feel white, because white means Christian, right? But from the perspective of someone of color, Jews of European origin, not all Jews, but do code as white. So it's, in that regard, it's very different. And also because Jews came to the United States even under duress, but they came as voluntary migrants, while people of color, for the most part, came as involuntary migrants and have a long history of legal social inequality. So I think what's so fascinating is that there are similarities and yet differences.
Absolutely.
In the American case, and the literatures that you've studied of this phenomenon, point out, again, differences in these two experiences, but also similarities.
Oh, yes.
So someone asked, someone wanted to know if you have thought about or think it's relevant the fact that passing is also used to describe dying. You know,
Oh, yes.
are there
Mm-hmm.
what do you make of those
Mm-hmm.
two, the meanings of the word? Yeah.
Right, right. There's certainly a semantic connection there between passing and dying, because as somebody dies, the euphemism is they passed away. They passed away. And in my research, I certainly talk about that. In one of the chapters of my book, I invoke Freud and The Death Drive. I won't bore you with too many details of that particular aspect of my research, but I will just say broadly that for a lot of African Americans who pass as white, they saw passing as a form of death, because they had to close the door and on their Black families, their Black past, and they decided to pass into whiteness. For somebody to pass into whiteness, they had to kill off their Blackness. They had to kill off their Black
But
past.
it's sort of metaphorical and symbolic as opposed to actually
It is
dying.
metaphorical, symbolic, and semantic connections here between passing as white and passing away. Often that just meant both the same thing, one and the same. Passing as white meant that Blackness had to pass away.
Yeah, you know, it's well, it's just fascinating. It's fascinating. I'm thinking, of course, the human stain. I won't go there. We'll wait till next week.
Next week.
But different characters or different individuals pass and do kill off the past, and others somehow can migrate to and from with a kind of complicity on the part of the family of, you can make it, go do it, even if
That's
at the
right.
cost of other things. So I think there's a psychological difference also.
And I'm yes, absolutely. I'm thinking of the book we're going to read in the last class, which is Nell Larson's Passing. I won't reveal too much, don't worry. But
No spoilers.
No spoilers, but I will say one character passes and the other one passes selectively. And this question is going to come up again in 2 weeks about who's passing for who and who's passing for what, right? And the movement between Blackness and whiteness, between Harlem and the East Village, it comes up time and time again.
Let me see. Trying to see. I'm looking here at the other screen because I have two screens. I have the questions. Someone, let me just see. Someone asked, I think this is a very interesting question, which has to do with the historicity of this phenomenon in the United States. Someone saying, because the society, despite everything, in fact, is more diverse, there's more in marriage, out marriage among all kinds of peoples. We have, you know, many different kinds of people married and or have relations with lots of other different kinds of people. You know, do you see a breaking down of the binary, or do you see these old labels holding firm in terms of passing?
I see the breaking down of the binary. Yes, I see it. But I will say that as long as we live in a racialized society where straight white men have all the power, the binary will still be upheld. So I don't want to confuse you. Like, the binary is still there. Yes, there's some people who are breaking it down, but it will not go away completely because straight white men still hold all the power in this country.
Okay, everyone, I'm trying to think, are there any more questions? There were lots of recommendations. So we will try and, someone mentioned Sherlock Holmes, someone mentioned Brittany, The Other Half. I mean, there are many, many books, The Personal Librarian. So I think, by the way, to our audience, the fact that so many of you have read books like this or know the topic shows us that this is a very relevant trope or relevant mode in which minorities, Blacks and Jews, interact with the majority Christian white society. The sense that belonging is contingent, right? Belonging is contingent on a certain assumption of other forms. And that is very, very challenging, right? That gets at the heart of what we think equality is, right? If to be equal means to be the same, is that really what we believe in is equality? And yet, how do you have a society where only difference is what's celebrated? So I actually think, I mean, in hearing the comments and looking at them, that this whole issue of passing actually gets to really big questions about how we define American freedom and American equality. And our authors are pointing out, because they're artists, the price and the challenge through their protagonists, what they give up, what they accept.
Mhm.
So, I thank you for that. Oh, another person is, these are all, people are mentioning all these things that are on our list already, but yes, the movie Little White Lies, excellent
Yes,
movie, British
it was
movie, yes.
excellent. Yes.
Yes,
Mhm.
excellent movies. And also
Mhm.
there's a series now on Netflix, Black Cake. But this is what I want to say before we close. For those of you who did not have the time to read the Langston Hughes short story that's on the Bildner Center website or the Heine description, please do, because they're not long and you'll enjoy them. And they will also you'll be stimulated by some of the conversation we've had tonight. And next week, we have excerpts, we put up excerpts from Philip Roth's The Human Stain. So please do read it, because it means the questions will be a little bit more textual than free flowing, even though free flow is good, but it will be nice if it's a little more textual. And the same thing for the third session, when we provided excerpts from Nella Larson's novel, Passing. So let me just see before we say goodnight and I say other things about the Bildner Center. Yeah, no, we're good. Okay, the only other comment I'm going to make for the audience, I think knows this well, that skin color, the racialized skin color, which is, how shall I say this? You can't disguise skin color. For Jews, we have an interesting gendered problem, right? Which is that male Jews historically have been, known because of male circumcision, right? And that was a physical sign, literally a physical sign, that made you a Jew and made you obvious as a Jew in the world in periods when, if there was discrimination, you could be exposed. Of course, in the United States, there's no compulsory circumcision. Only people circumcised, obviously Muslims too and Jews do it because of commitments. And women, Jewish women, have been able to, quote, pass more easily in European society than men, because they don't have a physical mark. So that just raises again a whole other set of questions about, if you will, the physicality or the biological issues involved with passing and assimilation. So that just put that in your collective heads out there. I want to mention two things. I've already told you. Yes, someone mentions we didn't talk about changing noses. Yes, we didn't talk about rhinoplasty. It's very important. Philip Roth's Goodbye Columbus. Read it. Brenda Potemkin has a perfectly bobbed nose. And the great Barbara Streisand did not alter her nose. Okay, I'll leave that anecdote aside. But I want to just tell everyone that not only do we have 2 more sessions for Professor Ramon's class, but Monday, December 4th, sort of before his class, we have a different kind of an opposite direction, compulsory opposite direction of forced conversion, which is a story, a true historical story and discovery about a Viennese cookbook, which was authored by a Jewish woman in the interwar years. And after her flight to England in 1938, after the Anschluss, the publisher of this cookbook Aryanized it. That is, they put a Viennese name, a non-Jewish name on this book, giving it a non-Jewish identity, a Viennese identity, for decades. And her granddaughter did the research to expose this forced conversion of this cookbook. And it's called Alice's Book. That's the name of the research. And the Bildner Center program is virtual, and it's at 1:00 on December 4th. Please register. Karina Orbach is an historian based in Cambridge, and I will be in discussion with her. So I hope to see you virtually there, and I hope to see you next week, same time, for the second part of Professor Ramon's class. So good night and be safe. And last, I want to thank Sarah Portilla and Matan, who are back office today on the program, helping it run smoothly. And of course, the rest of the staff, the Bildner Center, Karen Small, Amanda Gravenheis, Robin Auerbach, all of the staff, Darcy Marr, publicizing the program. Without them, nothing would happen, and we're incredibly grateful to their hard work.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone. Good night.
Good night.